My name is Lisa. I'm 40 years old, and I thought I knew my family like the back of my hand. I grew up in a house where everything seemed clear, predictable, stable. My parents were the kind of couple that goes through life without drama, held together by a quiet, almost sacred routine. But everything changed the day my father got sick, and Ruth walked through the door. She came in as a caregiver, a graceful, experienced woman, the kind who earns your trust just by making a cup of tea. But there was something in her eyes, something that recognized the house, that recognized me, and more than anything, that recognized my mother. The moment I saw them look at each other for the first time, I knew that wasn't a normal reunion. It was the past, knocking on our door. My mother, who had seemed so distant for years, suddenly came alive again in the smallest gestures. A faint smile, a soft sigh, a silence that came not from tiredness, but from memory. Ruth wasn't just an employee. She had been part of this story long before me. Before husband, before father, before all the roles. And maybe she was the only person my mother ever truly loved. It wasn't until I found a hidden photo, the two of them, so young, embracing with a tenderness that couldn't be ignored, that everything inside me fell apart. And at the same time, everything came together. Because love isn't always something that fades over time. Sometimes it's something that waits, that endures, that hides in silence until it's finally allowed to exist. This is the story I never thought I'd tell. A story about what hides behind perfectly pressed curtains, about glances that last a lifetime, and about the courage to accept that true love doesn't always follow the script society expects. My father fell for the second time in a week. This time it was in the bathroom, in the middle of the night. I found him on the floor, disoriented, his face damp with shame. He used to be such a strong man, but now he seemed as fragile as old glass. My mother stood silently in the doorway, like she had already seen it coming. I was shaking inside, but tried to stay composed. We do a good job pretending when we have no other choice. The next day, I went looking for help. I couldn't keep pretending I had it all under control. My mother, though still mentally sharp, had grown emotionally distant. She'd been absent for a long time, as if she had unplugged from her own life. When I brought up the idea of hiring a caregiver, she just nodded. And that's when, in a blur of urgency and desperation, Ruth came into my life. Or rather, came back. She introduced herself with a calm voice and eyes that seemed to carry more history than experience. She wore a soft, old-fashioned perfume that lingered in the hallway after she passed. Her hands were steady, and her elegance hard to describe. My father, who sometimes struggled to recognize even me, took her hand like he was reconnecting with someone dear. Ruth smiled. A smile filled with something I didn't yet know how to name. But it was my mother who surprised me most. When she saw Ruth at the door, she didn't speak. She didn't smile. She didn't move. She just stared, as if time had frozen. And Ruth held her gaze with a heavy silence, loaded with something deeply personal. Neither of them touched. Neither explained anything. But in that moment, I knew. These two women had once loved each other, or maybe still did. I spent the rest of the day watching them, Ruth adjusting my father's pillows with care, my mother staring out the window, lost in thought. It felt like something was being reenacted, only I hadn't been handed the script. The house looked the same, but the air had changed. There was a new kind of heat. Contained, almost sacred. Later that evening, I found Ruth in the kitchen. She was washing dishes with slow, deliberate movements. I walked up and asked how she was feeling. She looked at me like she was weighing each word carefully. Then she said, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." A simple sentence, but it hit me like a stone. And that's when everything started to shift inside me. I went to bed thinking about things I'd never thought before. What my mother had been like when she was young, who she might have been if she hadn't gotten married, and what was going to happen now with Ruth back. Part of me wanted to protect the house. Another part wanted to see it all fall apart, as if tearing down an old lie might finally set us all free. By the third day, I noticed Ruth and my mother had developed their own quiet routine. After my father's afternoon nap, they'd go to the back porch. They sat side by side, no TV, no distractions, just a cup of tea each and long silences between glances. I pretended to be busy, but watched from a distance, my heart pounding, unsure why. Around Ruth, my mother became someone else. Her shoulders softened, her eyes grew brighter. She even let out a soft laugh, the kind I hadn't heard since childhood. Ruth, for her part, never pushed. She waited. She offered presence without expectation. It was the kind of intimacy that can't be explained, only felt. And I felt it. All of it. Like I was witnessing something sacred. One afternoon, walking past the living room, I saw my mother holding Ruth's hand just a second longer than needed. When she noticed me, she pulled away quickly. But Ruth didn't. She just turned to me and asked if I wanted some tea too. There was no shame, no pretending. It was as if, for the first time, my mother was letting me see who she really was. And it hurt, but it also set me free. That night, I sat at the edge of my mother's bed. I wanted to ask everything, but didn't know where to start. She looked at me calmly and said, "You have kind eyes, Lisa, but not everything needs to be said out loud." I understood. Still, I walked away with my heart burning. There was so much I wanted to hear from her, so many stories left untold. The following week, my mother pulled a box from the closet and handed it to me. "If you want to understand, everything's in here." Inside were old photos, carefully folded letters, and little objects, a hair clip, a red ribbon, an old brooch. The photos were of them. Ruth and my mother, hugging, young, alive, radiant. I had never seen my mother like that before. I read one of the letters in silence, my eyes filled with tears. It was my mother's handwriting, writing to Ruth back in the 60s. Words of passion, of fear, of goodbye. They had loved each other, deeply. But my mother chose the expected path. Marriage, children, stability. Ruth left. And now, she was back. Not as a memory, but as something real. I closed the box and walked to the kitchen. Ruth was washing dishes as always, in silence. I approached slowly, holding the box against my chest. She didn't look at me, but said, in the calmest voice in the world, "You found it, didn't you?" And in that moment, I knew I was about to discover a version of my family I had never been told. On Sunday, I took my father outside to sit in the sun. Ruth prepared everything with care, a reclining chair, cold juice, a blanket for the wind. My mother showed up later with a book in her hands, but she didn't read a single page. She just watched Ruth from afar, like someone looking at a beloved ghost. When Ruth sat beside her, I had the strange feeling that the old house took a breath. After lunch, I left the three of them alone for a few hours. I went downtown to buy groceries and clear my head. When I got back, I found my mother in the living room, eyes red. She was holding the same brooch from the memory box. Ruth wasn't around. I sat next to her without saying a word. And then my mother spoke, her voice trembling. "You don't know what it's like to spend a whole life hiding who you are." That night, Ruth called me into the guest room. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands folded in her lap. Your mother and I were torn apart like weeds. They called us sick, sinners. We tried to forget. But the body doesn't forget. Her words cut through me. I had never heard someone talk about love with so much pain and longing at once. She stood up and handed me a faded letter, my name written by hand on the front. Your mother wrote this years ago, but never found the courage to give it to you. I opened it right there. It was an apology, not for loving Ruth, but for never showing me who she really was. I wanted to spare you the shame, she wrote, but what I felt wasn't shame. It was gratitude and a deep, aching emptiness. I went to my parents' bedroom. My mother was asleep. Ruth was gently fixing my father's blanket. When she saw me at the door, she didn't flinch. She simply motioned softly for me to come closer. I stood there, watching those two women who had lived so much and hidden even more. For the first time, I felt like hugging Ruth and hugging my mother for all she had been and never got to be. The next morning, I woke up before everyone else. I stepped out onto the porch and found Ruth already up, looking at the sky. I sat beside her. Neither of us said a word. We just sat there, breathing together. And for the first time since she arrived, there was no tension. There was acceptance, and maybe a new kind of beginning. I didn't know what was going to happen from here, but one thing was clear. Once the truth finds space, it doesn't go back in the drawer. I started seeing my mother with different eyes. The little things she did that once seemed like absent-mindedness now felt like hiding. She hadn't forgotten Ruth. She had just learned to bury her. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was history. And Ruth seemed to understand every pause. The past between them didn't scream. It whispered. That morning, my mother dropped a spoon just as Ruth walked by. They both bent down at the same time and, for a moment, knelt there, their faces close. A smile slipped out, small, wistful, and their eyes held the memory of what it felt like to touch without fear. Something in me cracked at that sight, not out of jealousy, but from sorrow for everything that had never been lived. That night, I asked her directly. My heart was pounding in my throat, but I did it. Mom, did you love Ruth? She didn't flinch. Not only did I love her, I belonged to her. I couldn't breathe. That sentence didn't come from a fragile woman. It came from a whole woman who had spent her life being half. Ruth walked in a moment later holding a blanket. My mother reached out her hand, and they touched. No shame, no hiding. Like they were done apologizing for existing. The days that followed were strangely calm. My father slept most of the time, and I started seeing Ruth as more than just a caregiver. She was the living memory of the woman my mother never got to be. A version of herself that had no place in the life she chose. A whole life shrunk to fit the mold of wife and mother. Watching my mother unfold now felt like watching a flower trying to bloom at the end of the season. One day, while organizing drawers, I found an old dress. Dark blue, light fabric, nearly forgotten in the back of the closet. I brought it to my mother. She held it like she'd just found a missing piece of herself. This was her favorite, she whispered. Ruth appeared in the doorway and paused. And in that silence, they both knew. That dress held more stories than any wedding album ever could. That night, my mother asked to wear it. It wasn't vanity, it was symbolic. Ruth helped her, her fingers trembling slightly. When my mother stepped out of the room, she looked taller, more alive. I held back tears. For the first time, I saw her whole. Not the homemaker, not the sick woman, but the woman who had desired, and been desired, who had loved, even when love was forbidden. I went out to the backyard and cried alone, not out of pain, but because I finally understood how cruel the world had been to women like her, because I'd grown up hearing about sin, shame, and what people would say. My mother loved another woman and survived by hiding it. Now, at 68, maybe she could finally be free, and I had to be worthy of that. I got a work message early that morning and went to my old house to take care of some paperwork. I walked into my childhood bedroom. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. The dolls on the shelf, the pink bedside lamp, the letters I used to write to boys I never actually liked. And suddenly, it hit me. My entire life had been shaped to look right. I just never knew for whom. When I came back, I found Ruth and my mother in the kitchen. It was an ordinary scene: tea, cookies, quiet conversation. But there was something different in the way they touched as they passed things to each other. There was no more shame, just tenderness. I looked at them and understood there was love there. And love doesn't need explaining. It just needs space to exist. After lunch, Ruth asked me to come into the bedroom. "There's something your mother kept for decades. She asked me to show it to you." In the back of the closet was a black velvet box. Inside, there was a necklace with a leaf-shaped pendant and a photograph. My mother, around 20 years old, holding Ruth's hand by a river. It looked like a stolen image from a dream no one was ever allowed to share. "She wanted to give it to you on your wedding day," Ruth said. "But she was afraid you'd find out." I stayed silent. I held the necklace, feeling the cold metal in my palm. It was more than jewelry. It was a symbol of everything that had lived in the dark. I put it on. Ruth smiled, and in that moment, I realized I was part of this story too. In the living room, my mother was sleeping. The TV was on low. I sat next to her and took her hand. She opened her eyes slowly, saw me wearing the necklace. No words were needed, just a small nod, a recognition, as if to say, "You know, and it's okay." It was the deepest moment I'd ever had with her. No questions, no answers, just truth. That night, I dreamed of two women dancing under a tree. They didn't speak, they just danced. One was my mother, the other Ruth. When I woke up, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't keep hiding what I knew. My mother deserved to live the rest of her days with freedom, and I needed to learn how to love without fear, starting with her. For the first time in my life, I saw love for what it really is: imperfect, enduring, quiet, but profoundly human. That week, my father took a sudden turn for the worse. He started forgetting simple words. He called my mother by her sister's name. There were moments of clarity, but most days felt like fog. Ruth cared for him with a tenderness that surprised me. She ran her hand through his hair like someone offering forgiveness, and I saw it clearly. There was no anger in her, just longing and compassion. One night, I found my mother sitting on the edge of the bed in a dark room. Ruth stood behind her, gently brushing her hair. It was an intimate gesture, almost like a ritual. I stood in the doorway, unnoticed, just watching. My mother sighed. "If he had known, do you think he would have let me go?" Ruth answered softly. "I think he always knew. He just chose not to see." I walked into the kitchen and sat in the dark. My hands were shaking. It felt like my parents' past was a house full of locked rooms I had never entered. I used to think my mother was the submissive one, but now I saw she was the one who survived, the one who swallowed love, the one who lived in silence to protect the family structure, and even then, never stopped loving. The next day, I took my mother for a walk in the garden. Ruth came too. The two of them walked hand in hand, unhurried. The neighbors could see, and for the first time, my mother didn't let go. There was something majestic about it, like she was saying to the world, "I'm done hiding." I felt proud and ashamed that it took me this long to understand the strength she had carried all those years. Later, I helped Ruth change the sheets on my father's bed. Our hands met in the middle of the fabric. She looked at me and said, "Your mother loves you more than anything, but she couldn't love herself fully and protect you at the same time." That broke me. I hugged Ruth. Not as a daughter hugs a caregiver, but as a woman hugs the kind of story that rarely gets told. That night, I sat alone in my room and wrote down everything I was living. For the first time, I understood my mother. I understood myself. And I understood that true love isn't perfect. It doesn't show up at the right time or with the person everyone expects. But it shows up, and it holds steady through the years like an old root, buried, invisible, but alive. And there, in the silence of the house, I made myself a promise. Before it's too late, my mother will know she can love in peace. That morning, Ruth asked if I wanted to hear the story from the beginning. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to protect my mother from the emotional toll, but Ruth assured me it wouldn't hurt her. We sat on the porch, Ruth holding a cup of tea, and she began to speak with a kind of care that felt like embroidery. It was 1965. Your mother came to the new school with that look, like she was carrying a secret. She described my mother as sweet but too upright, like someone who knew she wasn't allowed to make mistakes. She always sat in the back of the class, until one day, she was alone at recess, and I sat beside her. Ruth smiled. We looked at each other and we just knew. No one had to teach us. No one had to explain. Our bodies recognized someone who made us feel safe. They started by passing notes between the pages of their notebooks. Then came secret walks in the park, stolen kisses behind the church. But reality was cruel. Your mother got scared, said she could never tell anyone. Ruth took a breath. One day, she disappeared. They transferred her to another school. She never answered my letters again. She handed me one, yellowed with time, full of words that never arrived. I went back into the house holding the letter tightly to my chest. My mother was sleeping, her hair spread out on the pillow. I sat beside her and watched her face. There was so much I didn't know. She had to choose between living a love and surviving inside the rules. How many other women went through life without ever naming what they felt? How many were torn away from themselves? Later, I asked Ruth why she never married. She gave a half smile. I never doubted how I felt, only how ready the world was for it. I thought that was both beautiful and cruel. A love so sure, treated as wrong for so long. And in the end, she came back. She came back when my mother needed her most. That, to me, was love. That night, I sat in my old bedroom and reread Ruth's letter. There were no promises, just desire, tenderness, and fear. The words felt like they were written by a girl who loved with the intensity of someone who knew time could steal everything. I closed my eyes and thought, maybe my mother didn't erase the past. She just buried it deep, waiting for the day it would be safe to open. That day, I made myself another promise. As long as she's alive, I'll build that safe space. A place where she can love, remember, and exist. Without apology. We decided to take my parents to the town square. My father, more confused each day, grew calmer when he heard music. There was a little band playing at the gazebo. Ruth pushed his wheelchair gently, and my mother held his hand the way she used to when they were young. We sat near the trees. The air had that bittersweet scent of late afternoon, and time seemed to slow down. My father mumbled pieces of old songs. In a rare moment of clarity, he looked at my mother and asked, "Do you still dance?" She smiled. "Only if someone asks me to." Ruth, without missing a beat, held out her hand, and my mother stood up. In the middle of the square, two older women danced slowly, while the eyes of an aging man followed them, not with judgment, but with quiet wonder. It was one of the most beautiful moments of my life. The people around smiled. No one said a word, maybe out of respect, or maybe because they understood they were witnessing something rare. Old love, surviving love. My father clapped slowly, and I let myself cry, for their courage, for his innocence, and for me, for finally learning what love really is. We returned home in silence. My father fell asleep on the couch, the music still lingering. Ruth made tea, my mother changed slowly, and I watched the two of them with a tenderness that hurt. They weren't just two elderly women reliving the past. They were survivors, and I, the daughter who inherited this story, needed to do something with it, something more than just remembering. Before bed, I sat with my mother. I talked about the dance, about the way she smiled, about how Ruth looked at her. "Do you still love her?" I asked, and she answered without hesitation. I never stopped. She rested her head on my shoulder and whispered, "And now?" I allow myself. That now meant everything. It was time, reclaimed. A gift, finally received. I went to bed with a heart both light and heavy. Light because I saw her alive again. Heavy because I knew none of it came easy. But deep down, I knew. She still had time. They still had time. And I had the chance to turn this story into a full memory, not just a secret. That night, I fell asleep with a smile on my face. For the first time, proud to be her daughter. On Sunday, my mother called me early. She wanted to go to church. It had been years since she'd set foot there. She chose a light-colored dress, put on lipstick, and Ruth fixed her hair with the same careful touch as always. We arrived while the bells were still ringing. People recognized her. Some waved. Ruth stayed in a pew at the back. I sat between them, like an unexpected bridge. During the service, the priest spoke about forgiveness and truth, and my mother wept quietly. It wasn't guilt. It was relief, as if each word spoken finally found room inside her. I looked back at Ruth. Her eyes were fixed on my mother. There was no jealousy, only reverence. It felt like watching a silent promise being fulfilled, even after all these years. After Mass, an older woman approached us. "You're Estella's daughter, aren't you? Your mother was the heart of our school, always so kind." I smiled and thanked her, but something about her words stuck with me. Estella. Not Mrs. Estella, not the doctor's wife, just her. Maybe very few people ever truly knew my mother the way Ruth did. Her real name wasn't a title, it was a feeling. Back home, I found my father holding a small box on his lap. "I found this on the shelf," he said. It was an old brooch shaped like a flower. My mother covered her mouth with her hand. Ruth came closer and touched her shoulder. "You gave this to me on our first outing." My father frowned. "You gave it to me, didn't you?" My mother didn't answer, but the silence said everything. That night, I sat down to write it all. I didn't want to lose anything. Not the gestures, not the glances, not the silences. Every piece mattered. This story was made of moments that never fit in the family photo album. But now, I was stitching them together, page by page. And these women, alive and present, were handing me their truths like sacred secrets. I was ready to tell this story, not as a confession, but as a legacy. A story of women, of love, of courage, and of all the things that bloom, even after being buried for decades. That Monday, I decided it was time to open the bottom drawer of my parents' dresser. For years, it had been left untouched, like it hid not just objects, but silenced feelings. Inside was a small wooden box, the kind that locks with an old key. When I opened it, I found more than I expected. A thin wedding ring, a photo of the two of them as schoolgirls in uniform, and a letter, in my mother's handwriting. My eyes burned as I started reading. She wrote to Ruth as if she were saying goodbye to her own soul. She said she had loved more than she could bear, that she was afraid she wouldn't be able to go on living the right life, and that what they had shared was the only time she had ever felt whole. The letter had no date, but I recognized the guilt, the pain woven into every curve of her words. It was a confession from someone who had to erase herself just to keep existing. I asked Ruth to talk. I showed her the letter. She didn't speak right away, just held the paper like it was a piece of her own past. We sat in silence until she whispered, "She wrote this right after she got married." I froze. "How do you know?" She gave a sad smile. "Because I wrote the reply. But I never had the courage to send it." Ruth pulled out a folded envelope from her pocket, old but carefully kept. She handed me her letter. And there it was, the other side of the story. Ruth saying she understood my mother's choice, but would never stop loving her. That she would wait, even without knowing if there'd ever be a reunion. That she'd live off what was possible and turn absence into care, into silence, into distant presence. It was the most painful and beautiful thing I had ever read. Two women, separated by a world that never wanted them. The next day I gave both letters to my mother. She read them slowly, her eyes watery, her fingers trembling. "I remember every word," she said. "I wrote to her, but I never thought she actually read it." She looked out the window for a long while, searching the sky. Then she said, "You know what's saddest, my love? I lived more than half my life without ever listening to my own heart." I sat beside her and held her hand. "But now it's speaking." She nodded, her eyes full of tears. "It is, and even if it's late, it still wants to be heard." What moved me most was watching my mother's pain slowly turn into peace every time she looked at Ruth. There was no shame, no burden, just a kind of surrender that, though delayed, was still possible. That night, I left the two of them alone for a while. When I came back, they were sitting together on the couch in silence, one resting her head on the other's shoulder. They didn't say a word, but it was clear. Time doesn't erase everything, and sometimes what survives the waiting is what matters most. A few days later, my father had one of his rare lucid moments. We were all in the kitchen when he looked at my mother and said, with a surprisingly steady voice, "You still love her, don't you?" The room went silent. Ruth froze. I stopped breathing, but my mother didn't look away. "I do, João, and I'm sorry I wasn't honest with you sooner." My father didn't reply right away. He just lowered his head. I feared the worst, an outburst, an unbearable sadness. But when he looked up, his eyes held a gentleness I never expected. "I'm sad that it wasn't me who made you feel whole." My mother cried, Ruth cried, I cried, and then he added, "But if there's still time for that to happen, then I want to see it." That's when I truly understood the kind of love he had for my mother. Maybe it had never been fiery passion, but it had always been respect. Their life was built on silence and effort, and even in illness, even while forgetting names and dates, my father knew my mother deserved more than just survival. He gave her the last permission she needed, the permission to be truly happy. After that, he started calling her pretty girl when she walked into the room. He asked about the lady with the clear eyes, Ruth, as if it were the most natural thing. In his confusion, it was as though he had erased judgment and kept only tenderness. Sometimes when he saw them together, he'd smile and say things like, "I'm glad you're here," looking at Ruth. It made me believe that love, when real, can cut through even the fog of the mind. One afternoon, while I was sorting through old papers, I found a letter my father wrote in the 80s. A letter he never gave her. In it, he apologized for being emotionally absent, for noticing that she often seemed far away. "I don't know where you go when you look at me like that, but I hope it's a happy place. And if it's not, I hope someday you get there." I showed the letter to my mother. She read it with her hand on her chest. He knew, even if he didn't know. Ruth took her hand. "You've always been torn in two." And my mother replied in the calmest voice I've ever heard, "But now I know who I am whole." Those words stayed with me. My mother was rebuilding herself, and my father, even in illness, was helping her do it. That day, I learned that the most complicated stories are the ones that transform us the most, and that love, when it's real, knows how to make space for another love to grow. Something was missing in that house. A portrait, a symbol, a visible space for everything that had been lived, lost, and found again. So I decided to do something that might shock a few relatives, but made perfect sense to me. I had a photo framed, one of Ruth and my mother, young, taken on a school field trip with an analog camera. When it came back from the print shop, I showed it to my mother. She covered her mouth with her hand. Ruth came closer, gently touched the frame, as if she couldn't believe it. "That's you and me, the day we went to the river," my mother said. "I never thought that photo would survive." "Neither did I," Ruth replied, "and I never imagined it would hang on a wall one day. It was more than a photo. It was an altar to the truth." I asked my father where we should hang it. He pointed to the hallway wall between two family portraits. "Right there, because this is family too now." And so we did. Anyone who passed by saw two young women with love in their eyes, and anyone who asked got the whole story. My mother would say proudly, "That was the woman I loved," back when I wasn't allowed to. The house settled into a new kind of silence, no longer one of fear, but of respect. Ruth kept caring for my father with the same devotion. My mother smiled more often, and I felt like I finally belonged to a story that made sense. The secrets were no longer hidden. They breathed alongside us. They had names, faces, and a place at the table. One night, I heard laughter coming from the kitchen. It was the two of them, remembering old stories. My mother said, "Remember that teacher who always gave us a hard time?" And Ruth answered, "She knew. She just pretended not to see." They laughed like girls, like they had gotten their time back. And I, standing in the hallway, cried from emotion. Because in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. The framed photo seemed to smile too. It wasn't just a memory. It was resistance. It was living proof that even in a world that tried to silence so many loves, some survived. And they blossomed. And they found, in the end, a safe home. A place where love could finally be what it always was. It was my mother's home, Ruth's home, and now it was mine too. It was a clear Sunday morning when I suggested we take a new photo together. Not one of those stiff, posed portraits, but something that captured who we were now. Three women who had been through silence, discovery, and rebuilding. Ruth hesitated at first, as she always did when it came to taking up space. But my mother took her hand and said, "Let's make this moment last." Not as a request, but as an offering of freedom. We went to the backyard. The afternoon light fell gently on the leaves, as if time itself wanted to hide there with us. Lisa, me, set up the camera on the tripod and turned on the timer. We held each other close. Ruth stood on the right, my mother in the center, and I on the left, my arm resting on her shoulder. When the shutter clicked, we were smiling. A smile of those who had finally stopped hiding their story. The photo turned out beautiful. But more than that, it was honest. I printed it on matte paper and had it framed too. When I showed it to my uncle, my mother's brother, he didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then, with eyes full of emotion, he simply said, "Now you look whole." There was no judgment, no shock, just acceptance. And to me, that was more than I ever expected. Each day, my mother seemed lighter. She hummed softly while she cooked. She played the old records she and Ruth used to dance to in their youth. And sometimes, a little shyly, she told me stories from when they were just two girls quietly sharing dreams. Not as a confession, but as someone reclaiming a part of herself that had been locked away deep in memory. Ruth, too, began to bloom. She no longer just cared for my father. She was part of the home. She placed fresh flowers on the breakfast table. She sewed dish towels with small details you only noticed if you looked closely. She turned care into poetry. And in every gesture, I could see a love that had never died, just waited, patiently, for its time. One day, my mother told me she wanted to write a letter, not to anyone, just to herself. I want to put on paper everything I couldn't say out loud for 40 years. I gave her a blue-covered notebook with blank pages, no lines. "So you can write however you want." She smiled. And that very afternoon I saw her on the porch, head down, writing nonstop, as if she were finally giving voice back to her own soul. In that moment I understood. My mother wasn't just living a new love. She was rebuilding her youth, her desires, her identity. And Ruth, in silence, in presence, was part of that restoration. I felt lucky to witness it, to call something so rare my family, a love that survived the walls of time. Everything felt calm that morning. Sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, and Ruth was making chamomile tea while my mother read an old magazine in the living room. I took the opportunity to sort through some paperwork in the office. But around 9:30, I heard a sudden thud. I ran to the hallway and saw my mother on her knees, one hand on her chest. Ruth was already by her side, holding her firmly, but without panic. We called the ambulance. The minutes felt like hours. While we waited, my mother held Ruth's hand and kept repeating, "Don't leave me." And Ruth, eyes wet, simply said, "I never did." That pierced through me. In that moment, every word unspoken for decades was there, poured into two sentences spoken with fear and love. The past, the present, and the future compressed into seconds. At the hospital, the doctors ran tests, adjusted her medication, and monitored everything. It was a heart issue, but it was under control. Still, the scare had shaken us. That night, the three of us sat by her hospital bed, and I understood what it meant to feel time slipping through your fingers, and at the same time, what it meant to still have time. Because true love doesn't need promises, it just needs presence. My mother looked at me and Ruth. "If I go someday, I want you two to stay together." Ruth took her hand. "You're not going anywhere yet." My mother smiled weakly. "But when I do, don't let our story disappear." And I promised right then that I wouldn't, that I'd tell this story with every word it deserved. Because their love belonged to me too. It was legacy, it was root. When we got home, everything felt more precious. The carefully washed dishes, the folded sheets, the photos on the shelf. Ruth started sleeping in the room next door, just in case. And every morning, the first sound I heard was her gentle voice asking, "How are you feeling, my love?" And my mother would answer, "Better, now that you're here." Their love was no longer a secret. It was routine. It was life. For so long I thought I knew what love was. But now I saw it differently. Love was this: the meticulous care, the quiet understanding, the respect for what had been and what still could be. It was knowing that even when the body falters, affection remains, steady, vibrant, whole. And in the end, loving someone is choosing to stay, even when you're no longer sure of anything. That night, I went to bed and placed my hand over my heart. I thought about my mother, about Ruth, about myself. I thought about how much of us is made of inherited silences and guarded affection. And I realized that sometimes what we need most is simply the courage to let love exist, even if it comes late, even if it arrives with wrinkles and a tired memory. My mother's 80th birthday came, and this time there would be no hidden surprises or forced smiles. She wanted something simple: an orange cake with sugar glaze, a table with flowers from the yard, and Ruth by her side. No party, sweetheart, just the people who understand my silence. I invited a few close friends, kind neighbors, and 2 cousins who always led with heart, not judgment. That afternoon, my mother wore a pale blue dress. Ruth helped her with the buttons. Lisa, me, made the coffee and set the table with the care of someone who knows that some moments must be perfect without being grand. When the guests arrived, they found a serene woman, hair done, eyes full of stories. She welcomed them with grace, but it was Ruth who sat to her right. In a moment of courage, my mother raised her glass of juice and said, "Thank you to those who loved me as I was, and to those who still love me, now that I am who I've always been." Ruth looked at her, eyes glistening. The guests applauded silently. There were no more secrets, just a full story, told through glances, gestures, memories. A story that was finally respected by everyone around it. After the birthday song, she asked for one more picture, but this time, just with Ruth. I want to remember this moment like this, with her. And so it was. The 2 of them smiling, holding hands. I took the photo and saved it like treasure. Somehow I knew it would be her last birthday. But there was no sadness. There was a sense of completeness. Because my mother had arrived exactly where she'd always wanted to be. A place where love no longer had to hide. That night, she sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket. Ruth was by her side. I sat in the rocking chair. The sky was clear, the stars visible, and the silence between us was beautiful. It didn't hurt anymore. It was a silence of peace, the kind where you no longer need to explain yourself. "Thank you for not giving up on me," my mother said. "Thank you for existing," Ruth replied. And I, with my heart full, just smiled. The lines on my mother's face told more than words ever could. They were maps of everything she had lived, fought, buried. But now, she was free. And seeing Ruth beside her was the greatest proof that true love doesn't need to arrive on time. It only needs space to bloom. And they made it, even late, even after everything. Months after that quiet night on the porch, something shifted in me. I began to understand that not everything has to last to be eternal. Sometimes, just a few moments lived in truth are enough to fill a whole life. My mother was still fragile, but her energy came from affection. And Ruth, once again, was her support. An old support, relearned, that no longer needed to hide. Our days fell into a slow rhythm, full of detail. Breakfast with toast buttered to perfection. The radio playing old boleros softly. the sound of a brush gliding through my mother's hair, always by Ruth's hand. Life had become a patchwork of small gestures, and it was those gestures that held everything together. Love was no longer a word, it was a practice. I started writing about all of it, not just to record it, but to understand it. What it means to love late, the inherited silences that hold us back, what it is to be the daughter of a woman who only became whole at 80. I wrote at night, when the house was quiet, trying to turn into sentences what my eyes saw, but what was still hard to name. It was my way of giving thanks and of setting us free. One morning, my mother called me to her room. She was sitting on the bed, holding an envelope. "This is for you. Read it when I'm no longer here." I tried to protest, but she smiled calmly. "It's not a goodbye. It's care." I placed the envelope in a wooden box, not out of fear, but out of respect for her timing. Ruth looked at me that night like someone who had written many letters like that, and kept every one. My mother's health came and went. Some days were bright, others more quiet. But she never again hid who she was. She spoke of Ruth openly, shared stories from their youth with a spark in her eyes, and even in her most tired moments, she always wanted Ruth near. "She's my peace," she would say. And I understood, because she had become mine too. Ruth was now the strongest root in our home. One day, while looking at an old photo together, my mother said, "Have you ever noticed we always return to whoever once felt like home?" In that moment, I understood everything. She wasn't just living a late love. She was finally living her truth, owning her name, her story, without shame, without fear. And as her daughter, that was the greatest gift I could receive, the chance to see her free at last. She slept peacefully that night and never woke up again. It's been a year since my mother passed, and every day I still talk to her, sometimes in my thoughts, sometimes out loud. Ruth still lives with us, not because she had to, but because none of us wanted to leave. My mother's room still carries her scent. Her blue notebook rests on the vanity, and the hairbrush Ruth always used remains, like a little altar of affection. Her absence fills everything, with beauty. It took me weeks to open the envelope. My hands trembled as I did. Inside was a single page with a few words. "Thank you for letting me live, for letting me love, and for not turning my past into shame. You gave me the courage I spent a lifetime trying to find." I read it sitting on the floor of her room with Ruth by my side. We cried silently, not from grief, but from recognition. Now in the kitchen, it's the two of us, two women caring for each other. Ruth teaches me old recipes. I teach her how to use phone apps. Sometimes we go for walks around the neighborhood, and people look at us kindly. "Is she your grandmother?" they ask. "My oldest friend," I reply, because explaining Ruth is impossible. She's love that survived time, a seed that kept trying to grow, even in the driest soil. I made a copy of that garden photo and hung it in the living room. Underneath, I wrote by hand, "What blooms late, blooms strong. Everyone who visits stops in front of it. No one asks anything, but everyone smiles, and that's enough." Sometimes a whole life can be told through a single gesture, an image, a well-lived silence. And that photo is exactly that.